The water took the boy fast, the way water always takes the small ones, without warning and without mercy, and by the time the current had him, he was already too far from the dock for any voice to reach. It was a grey morning at the edge of a southern bay, the kind of morning where the fog sat low on the pilings and the gulls kept their distance, and an old man named Walter Boyd was the only soul on that stretch of water who saw the small dark head go under. He was 61 years old that year. His hands were ruined by salt and rope. His boat was older than the boy's father, and he had no business diving into a cold tide with a bad shoulder and a heart that skipped when he climbed his own porch steps. He went in anyway. What he could not have known, what no one on that grey water could have known, was that the boy he was about to pull from the dark would one day stand over a different body, in a different kind of cold room, holding a different kind of life in his two hands, and that the small, drowning child he saved with a fisherman's grip would grow into the one man in the world who could save him back. He had no idea. The boy had no idea. The bay kept its secret the way bays do, folding the morning over the moment, and the years carried both of them away in opposite directions. Stay with this one, because the thing that comes back around is going to take its time, and it is worth the wait. Walter had lived his whole life within sight of that water. He had been born in a clapboard house a half-mile up the marsh road, the third of 7 children, and he had gone to work on the boats at 13 because his father's back gave out and somebody had to bring in the catch. He learned the bay the way other boys learned a schoolyard, by the feel of it under him, where the channel ran deep and where the sandbar lifted at low tide and where the crabs bedded in the cool months. He never married young, then never married at all, and the people in the little town off the highway came to think of him as a fixture, like the tide chart nailed to the bait shop wall or the rusted crane at the end of the public pier. He was not a talker. He fixed engines for the younger men who could not afford the marina rates, and he kept a coffee can of mismatched bolts under his workbench that he would not sell to anyone but would give to anyone, and he gave away more fish than he sold, leaving a string of croaker on a widow's porch rail before dawn and never knocking. On Sundays he sat in the back pew of a small brick church and put a folded $5 bill in the plate, even in the months when $5 was a real decision, and when the curtain basket came down his row he would look at his own hands rather than the plate, because he did not want the giving to be a thing anyone watched. People liked him without quite knowing him. The man at the bait shop, a heavy, slow fellow named Lonnie who had run the register for 30 years, said once that you could set your tides by Walter and never get a word of weather out of him. That was how Walter wanted it. A man who has spent his life pulling things out of deep water learns that the deepest things stay quiet, and he had made himself quiet to match them. He had pulled men from the water before, a swamped crabber one August, a drunk teenager off a capsized jet ski one 4th of July, and each time he had set them on the dock and gone back to his work, and let the story belong to whoever wanted to tell it, which was never him. The boy's name was Andre. He was 8 years old that grey morning, down at the bay with a cousin who was supposed to be watching him, and was instead chasing a crab along the rocks. Andre had wandered to the edge of the old dock where the boards were soft, and a wave had slapped the piling, and his sneaker had slid, and the water had him before he understood that he was falling. He could not swim. Most of the children in that part of town could not swim, because the public pool had closed when the money ran out, and the bay was the only water, and the bay was not a place anyone learned anything gently. He went down once, he came up screaming, swallowed the grey water, went down again. The cousin on the rocks did not even turn around. The only person who turned was the old man tying off his boat 40 yards away, and Walter did not think, he moved, because 40 years of moving toward the water in an emergency had worn the thinking clean out of him. He hit the cold so hard it stopped his breath. His bad shoulder screamed when his arm went over his head. He went under once himself, came up spitting, found the small thrashing shape by feel more than sight in the churning grey, and he got a fist into the back of the boy's collar the way he would grip a net heavy with the morning's haul, and he hauled. The current did not want to give the boy up. It pulled the both of them sideways toward the channel, and Walter's chest burned, and his legs went slow and heavy in the cold, and there was a long, terrible stretch of seconds where he was not sure the water would let either of them go. Somewhere in that stretch he made the old animal bargain a man makes when he is past his strength, that he would spend whatever was left in him and not count the cost. And he kicked for the pilings with the boy's weight, dragging him down, and his heart hammering a warning he chose not to hear. He got a hand on a barnacled post, and the barnacles opened his palm, and he did not feel it. He got the boy's chest over his own forearm. He pounded the small back with the flat of his hand until the bay came up out of the boy in a long, ugly rush, water and bile and a thin cry, and then the boy was breathing, alive, coughing the grey onto the old man's neck, and Walter pinned him against the cold piling and shook with the cold and the effort, and did not let go, not for anything, until he was sure the breathing would keep on by itself. He carried Andre up the boat ramp and set him on the warm hood of somebody's parked truck, and wrapped him in his own canvas coat. By then the cousin had finally noticed, and a woman from the bait shop had come running, and there was the small commotion that gathers around a near thing. Andre's mother arrived 20 minutes later, having run the half-mile from the bus stop, and she pressed her son to her chest and wept and tried to thank the old man, and the old man, dripping and grey-lipped and embarrassed by all of it, said only that the boys should learn to swim, and that the dockboards were rotten and the town ought to fix them. Then he took his coat back, because it was the only coat he had, and he got in his boat, and he went back out on the water as if a thing of no particular size had happened. He did not give the family his name. The woman from the bait shop knew it, and she told Andre's mother later. But by then the old man had become in the boy's memory a kind of weather, a force that had come out of the fog and put him back on the land and gone again. Andre was 8. He remembered the cold and the grip and the canvas coat that smelled of fish and diesel. He did not remember the face. What Andre carried out of that water was not gratitude, not at first, because 8-year-olds do not know how to be grateful for their own lives. What he carried was a question that would not leave him alone, and the question was simply this: why had a stranger spent himself for a boy he did not know? His mother, Renee, a home health aide who worked nights bathing and lifting the old and the dying in a county nursing home for $9 an hour, did not have the schooling to answer it, but she had the faith to frame it. She would come home off the night shift with her feet swollen in her white shoes and her uniform smelling of bleach and other people's sickness, and she would find her son already awake at the kitchen table, with a library book open under the bare bulb, and she would sit across from him with a cup of instant coffee and tell him again the thing she needed him to believe. She told him the Lord put people in the water with us, that no one crossed any deep place alone, and that the only way to thank a person who pulled you out was to spend your own life pulling. Andre did not understand it then. He understood it the way a child understands a song, by the shape of it before the meaning, and the shape stayed with him. He learned to swim that summer, taught by a deacon named Carl, who took the church children to a lake on Saturdays in the bed of his pickup, 6 of them holding onto the wheel wells the whole bumpy ride out. The deacon stood waist-deep in the brown lake water and held his broad hand flat under each child's belly and said, "Kick, just kick, I have got you." And one Saturday he took his hand away without telling Andre, and the boy swam 4 strokes on his own before he realized no one was holding him. By the time he was 12, he was the one watching the smaller kids at the edge of the water, counting heads, calling them back from the drop-off. By the time he was 16, he was reading anatomy books from the public library at the kitchen table while his mother slept off her night shift, tracing the diagram of the human heart with one finger until he could draw it from memory. And when the guidance counselor asked him what he wanted to be, he said a doctor, and the counselor, who was kind and tired and had heard the word doctor from 100 children who never got within a mile of it, wrote it down and did not quite believe him. Here is the thing about a debt you did not ask to owe. It does not press on you like a bill. It pulls on you like a tide, slow and constant and impossible to argue with, and Andre let it pull him. He worked 3 jobs through college, stocking a grocery before dawn, tutoring chemistry in the afternoons, mopping a gym floor at night, and he kept his grades at the top of his class on 4 hours of sleep, because the debt did not allow for anything less. He slept 4 hours a night through medical school too, and ate from the hospital cafeteria's day-old rack. The bruised fruit and the wrapped sandwiches marked half price at 9 in the evening, and he wore the same 2 pairs of shoes until the soles let go, and he taped them and wore them another month. His mother sold the gold cross she had worn since her own mother gave it to her, sold it for $60 at a pawn shop on the boulevard, to help cover the application fees the year he applied for residency, and she never told him she had done it. He found out years later only because I did note the bare place at her throat in an old photograph and asked her where the cross had gone, and she waved her hand and said she'd lost it somewhere, and he understood from the way she would not meet his eyes that she had not lost it at all. He became a surgeon. A trauma surgeon, specifically, the kind that stands at the door of the worst nights and pulls people back across the threshold. And if you had asked him why he chose the specialty, where the patients arrive drowning in their own blood and the clock is the enemy, he would not have connected it to a grey morning on a southern bay. Because he had buried that morning so deep, he no longer knew it was the floor he stood on. He told himself he liked the speed of it, the clarity, the way trauma stripped a problem down to one question: will this person live? And put the answer in your hands. You know better. You have known since the first minute. And that is the ache of it, watching a man build his whole life around a debt to a face he cannot remember. Walter, meanwhile, grew old. The years that lifted Andre out of poverty pressed Walter further into it. His shoulder never healed right after that morning in the bay, and the work got harder, and the younger men with newer boats and sonar and refrigerated holds took the good water and the good prices, and one bad winter the engine he could not afford to replace finally died for good, seized up in the channel on a freezing morning, and had to be towed in by a man who charged him for the favour. He sold the boat to a scrap man for $300, less than a third of what it was worth, and he watched it loaded onto a flatbed and hauled up the marsh road. And that was the only time Lonnie at the bait shop ever saw the old man look like he might come apart, standing at the end of the pier with his hands in his pockets, while the thing that had been his whole working life went away on a truck. He moved into a single room above the bait shop, a room with a hot plate and a cot, and one window that looked at the water he could. No longer work, and he did statistical for cash, lawn mowers and outboards and screen doors, and he kept putting his folded bill in the church plate, though it was a single now and not a 5. He did not think of himself as a man who had done a great thing. He had pulled a boy out of the water once, the way you would pull anyone out of the water, and he assumed the boy had grown up somewhere and forgotten him, which was right, and which did not trouble him, because he had not done it to be remembered. The only thing that troubled Walter, in the long, quiet evenings above the bait shop with the radio turned low, was his chest. It had been skipping for years. He had felt it first as a flutter, a bird trapped under the ribs, and he had told no doctor because there was no doctor to tell and no money to tell one with. Now it skipped and then clenched, and the clench would walk down his left arm and sit there like a hand. And he would put his palm flat on the table and breathe slow and wait for it to pass, and it always passed until the evening it did not. He went down in the bait shop on a Tuesday in late autumn, between the minnow tank and the door, and the boy who worked the register called for help, and the ambulance carried him an hour inland to the regional trauma centre, because the small county hospital had closed its cardiac unit 2 years. Before, he was unconscious when they wheeled him through the doors. He was 79 years old, with no family listed, no emergency contact, a wallet holding $11 and an old church bulletin, and a faded photograph of a boat. The night was already bad in that trauma centre. A pile-up on the interstate filling the bays, and the surgeon on call was moving from one ruined body to the next at a run. And the surgeon on call that night was a tall, tired man of 53 with steady hands, and a way of going very quiet when the work got hard. And his name was Andre. He did not look at the old man's face when they first brought him in. He looked at the monitor, the rhythm, the failing pump of a heart that had been skipping for years and was now giving out. And he made the calls a trauma surgeon makes, and he prepped to open the old man's chest, and he still did not know. The bay had kept its secret for 45 years. It was about to give it back. Was alive still, 81 and slowing but sharp, and she lived now in a comfortable house Andre had bought her on a quiet street, with a garden and a porch and no more night shifts ever again. He called her most evenings on his way out of the hospital, and on this night he would call her later than usual, and what he would have to tell her would put her on her knees in her own kitchen with the phone pressed to her face. All that came after. First came the long hours of the old man's surgery, the bypass that Andre's hands performed, without his mind, yet understanding whose ribs they were spreading, whose heart they were holding, whose life had once held his. He worked through the night under the white lights, the anesthesiologist calling out pressures, the scrub nurse setting each instrument in his open palm before he asked for it, the heart going still under his hands, the way every heart on that table went still, stopped on purpose, so a man could mend it and start it again. The interstate kept feeding him bodies, the broken and the bleeding from the pileup arriving in waves, and he moved between them. The old fisherman and a young mother and a trucker and a teenager, one ruined chest to the next, and the old man with no emergency contact was stabilized and moved to recovery near dawn. Andre, grey-faced and emptied out, the way he was at the end of every bad night, finally peeled off his gloves and went to the nurse's station to write his notes. It was the chart that did it. It was the simplest thing. A nurse named Pam had finally tracked down a next-of-kin lead, an old bait shop owner who knew the patient, and answered his phone at 4 a.m, and she had written down on the intake the few facts the bait shop owner had offered. And one of those facts was a name, the patient's full name, Walter Boyd, and beside it, in the nurse's careful hand, a note. Pulled a drowning child from the bay decades back, local story, never made anything of it. Andre stood in the hallway and read that line 4 times. The name meant nothing. The bay meant something. He did not move for a long moment. Then he was 8 years old again, in the cold and the grey, with a fist gripping the back of his collar, and a canvas coat that smelled of fish and diesel, and the question that had pulled at him his entire life, the question that had built him, the question that had made him a surgeon, finally turned around in the hallway of that trauma centre and showed him its face. He walked back into the recovery bay on legs that did not feel like his. The old man was awake now, weak, blinking up at the ceiling lights. Andre looked at the face for the first time in 45 years, and he did not recognize it, because he had never seen it, because on that grey morning he had been underwater and choking, and the man had been a force in the fog and not a face. And still Andre knew. He knew the way you know the floor is there when you finally look down. He pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat, and for a moment the trauma surgeon, who could not be rattled by the worst nights of human ruin, could not find a single word. He found one finally. He said the old man's name, soft like a question. Walter turned his head on the pillow and looked at the tired surgeon, and did not know him either. And why would he? And he said in a voice scraped down to almost nothing that he supposed he had given everyone a scare. Andre asked him carefully whether it was true, the thing on the chart about a boy in the bay. Walter's eyes went somewhere far off, the way old men's eyes do when you hand them a piece of their own past, and he said yes, a long time ago. A little fellow went off the rotten dock, and he happened to be tying up his boat, and it was nothing. The boards were the problem. The town never did fix them. He did not say it with any weight. He said it the way you mention weather from a year you can barely recall. And Andre, 53 years old, a man who had stood unmoved at the door of more death than most people will ever imagine, put his face in his hands at the bedside of a stranger who was not a stranger, and his shoulders shook, and the old man, alarmed, reached out one ruined hand and patted the surgeon's arm and told him not to take on so, that whatever it was, it would pass. It did not pass. It turned instead into the rest of both their lives. When Andre could speak, he told the old man who he was. He told him about the 8-year-old off the rotten dock, the cold, the grip, the canvas coat, He told him that he had spent 45 years trying to answer the question of why a stranger would spend himself for a boy he did not know, and that the answer had been lying in a hospital bed in front of him the whole time, breathing on a machine Andre's own hands had connected. Walter listened. His face did the slow work of an old man reassembling a morning from long ago and setting a grown surgeon's face on top of a drowning child's, and when he had it, when the two finally clicked together behind his eyes, the old man's chin trembled and he turned his face to the wall because he had spent his whole life being quiet about the deepest things. And he did. Not have any practice at this, he said. The only thing he could find, he said. He was glad the boy had learned to swim. Andre laughed, a wet and broken laugh, and said that he had taught half the kids at his church to swim too, that he had never once stood at the edge of any water without thinking a stranger ought to be watching the small ones. The two men held on to that, the swimming, because it was solid ground, and they were both men who needed solid ground. That was the night Andre finally made the call he had promised himself on the way out of the hospital. He sat in his car in the parking deck under the orange lights and dialed his mother, and when she answered, sleepy and worried at the late hour, he could not get the words out at first. He told her he had found him. He told her the man from the bay was alive, that he had been on his table that very night, that the hands she had prayed over for 50 years had held the heart of the man who saved her son. There was a silence on the lights, and then a sound he had heard from his mother only a few times in his life, and she had to set the phone down on the kitchen counter, and he could hear her through the speaker, down on her knees on the linoleum, thanking a God she had never once doubted, and he sat in the dark of the parking deck and let her. 'Cause some prayers a man does not interrupt. I want you to sit in this with me for a second, because moments like this are the reason any of us keep faith in anything. If a kindness you have already half forgotten has ever come walking back into your life, wearing a face you did not expect, tell me about it before this is over. Walter recovered slowly, and Andre did not let him recover alone. He came to the recovery floor on mornings he was not even on the schedule, standing at the foot of the bed with 2 coffees, learning the old man the way he learned a hard case, patiently and all the way down. He learned that Walter took his coffee black and strong enough to stand a spoon in, that he could not abide the television and wanted only the window, that he had a way of going quiet for a long time and then saying one true thing. The old man had no family listed because the old man had no family, and the surgeon had spent his whole adult life with a hole in him exactly the shape of a man he could not name. And the two of them fit together over the following weeks the way a key fits a lock that has been waiting in the dark. Andre moved Walter, when he was strong enough, out of the single room above the bait shop and into a small, bright apartment near the hospital, and he carried the old man's few boxes up himself and would not hear of a mover. Then, when it became clear that neither of them wanted the distance, he moved him again into the comfortable house on the quiet street where Renee lived, the house with the garden and the porch. Renee, who had told her son 45 years ago at a kitchen table that the only way to thank the man who pulls you from the water is to become one, met him at her own front door on a warm October afternoon. She was 81, and she came down the porch steps slow, and she took his ruined hands in her small ones, the hand that had once gripped the back of her drowning son's collar, and she could not speak at first. Then she said thank you in a voice that had been saving the word up for half a century. Walter, undone, looked at the porch boards and said it was nothing, that anybody would have done it, shook her head and held on tighter. She told him, gently, that not anybody did do it. That of all the people on that water that morning, he was the only one who turned around, and that it was her whole life standing in front of her now in scrubs, and that he would let her cook for him whether he liked it or not. She made him pork chops and rice that first night and watched him eat 2 helpings, and something in her that had been clenched for 45 years finally let go. The hospital, when the story got out, wanted to make a thing of it, and Andre would not let them, because the old man hated a fuss, and the surgeon had learned from the old man without ever meeting him that the deepest things stay quiet. There was no plaque, no newspaper, no ceremony. There was, instead, an old fisherman in a rocking chair on a warm porch, learning the names of Renee's roses, mending the small broken things around a house that did not really need mending, because mending was the only thanks he knew how to give. There was a surgeon who came home earlier than he used to, who sat on the porch steps in the evenings and listened to an old man tell water stories, and who finally understood the specialty he had chosen, the door he had spent 30 years standing in, the drowning strangers he had pulled back across the threshold, one after another after another. He had been paying a debt the whole time without knowing the name of the man he owed. Now he knew the name. He said it often, just to have it in his mouth, the name he had carried as a force in the fog, and could now set on a face in a rocking chair 8 feet away. Walter lived 4 more years. They were the warmest of his long life, and he knew it, and he said so once on a spring evening on the porch. In the offhand way, he said the things that mattered most. He fell into a rhythm in that house that he had not had since he was a boy with 6 siblings around a loud table. He rose early out of lifelong habit and made the coffee before Renee was up, and he learned the names of her roses, the climbing red one by the rail and the small pale one by the steps, and he kept the garden hose coiled and the gate oiled and the loose board on, the 3rd step screwed down tight. He mended the small broken things around a house that did not really need mending, because mending was the only thanks he knew how to give, and Renee let him, because she understood that a man who has worked his whole life does not know how to be loved sitting still. On Sundays, the 3 of them went to a church near the quiet street, and Walter sat in the back pew, out of old instinct, and put a folded bill in the plate and looked at his own hands, and Renee would reach over and pat the folded bill flat against his palm and make him hold on to it, and put one of her own in instead, which was an argument they had every week and which she always won. He told Andre that a man does not get to choose the size of the thing he does, that he had only pulled one small boy out of one cold morning and had gone home and never thought himself any kind of hero, and that he could not have known, tying up his boat in the fog, that he was not saving one life but every life that one boy would go on to save. Andre, who kept a private count, and knew the number, who knew exactly how many drowning strangers had come through his door over 30 years and gone home to their own porches, did not tell the old man the number, because the number was not the point. He only put his hand on the old man's arm, the same arm that had once gripped the back of his collar, and the 2 of them watched the light go down over a garden a long way from any bay. 2 men the same water had made, sitting in the quiet that the deepest things prefer. When Walter died, he died in that house, in a real bed, with Renee's hand in one of his and Andre's in the other, and the surgeon who had pulled hundreds of strangers back across the threshold could not pull this one, and did not try, because it was not that kind of leaving. It was the other kind, the kind that has earned its rest. They buried him up the marsh road, within sight of the water, the way he would have wanted, and the small brick church was fuller than anyone expected. It turned out that the quiet man who gave away fish and put his folded bill in the plate had pulled more than one person out of more than one kind of deep water over the years, and the town had been keeping a ledger even while the man kept none. The swamped crabber came, an old man himself now, and the teenager off the jet ski came, grey at the temples with children of his own. Lonnie from the bait shop came in a suit nobody had ever seen him wear. A widow whose porch rail had carried a string of croaker before dawn, for 20 winters came and sat in the front and wept like family. One after another, they stood in the aisle and said the same small thing in different words, that Walter had done a thing for them once and never spoke of it again. And the room filled slowly with the size of a life that had hidden itself on purpose. Andre stood at the front of that church, a tall, tired surgeon in his good dark suit, and he did not give a long eulogy, because the old man would have hated a fuss. He said only that a stranger had once spent himself for a boy he did not know, that the boy had spent his whole life trying to answer why, and that the answer was the simplest one there was, the one his mother had given him at a kitchen table 45 years before. The Lord puts people in the water with us, and the only way to thank one is to become one. The canvas coat is what he kept. It had hung for decades on a nail above the bait shop, The same coat the old man had wrapped a shivering boy in on a grey morning and then taken back, because it was the only good coat he had, and the bake shop owner had saved it without quite knowing why. And he gave it to Andre after the funeral. Andre brought it home and hung it on the back of the porch door, where it still smells faintly of salt all these years later. And on cold mornings he takes it down and puts it on, and goes and stands at the edge of his mother's garden with his coffee. An old fisherman's coat on a retired surgeon's shoulders, and he thinks about the tide that pulls things slow and constant and brings them back, around in their own time. His mother is gone now too, and the house is his, and the roses she planted still come up every spring, red against the porch rail. He is an old man himself these days, the age as Walter was that grey morning on the bay, and his hands have gone steady still the way old hands do, and on Saturday mornings he drives down to a lake, an hour out of town, where a deacon once taught a poor boy to swim, and he stands at the edge of the water in a coat that smells of diesel and salt, and he watches the small ones, every single one of them, because somebody once watched him, and a man does not get to choose the size of the thing he does. He only gets to do it. So if you have a kindness in you today that nobody asked for and nobody will repay, do it anyway and tell me in a word what it was, because the water has a long memory. And if this one stayed with you, there is another like it waiting, about a debt that took a lifetime to come home.